My name is Evelyn Marchand, and on the night of our golden anniversary, as my husband stood before friends and family with a glass of champagne raised high, I saw something flicker behind his smile. You might think a woman like me, well-mannered, traditional, a retired music teacher, who still arranged fresh flowers every Sunday, would be the last to suspect betrayal. But eyes trained in classical piano don't miss subtle shifts, and hearts raised in silence learn to listen for the dissonance beneath the melody. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. The celebration was held at the ballroom of the Westfield Conservatory, where I'd once performed Chopin to a sold-out crowd. My daughter had insisted on the venue for sentimental reasons. I'd found the suggestion charming until that night. There was a sourness in the air I couldn't quite place. The room sparkled with golden lights and polite laughter, but something inside me had already begun to fracture. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his boutonniere slightly askew. I remember straightening it just before the speech, brushing invisible lint off his shoulder. "You nervous?" I asked with a smile, keeping my tone light. "No," he said too quickly. "Why would I be?" That was the first crack. When he finally took the microphone, the room hushed. Guests leaned in. He cleared his throat once, then twice. "I want to thank all of you," he began, "for being part of 50 wonderful years with the woman who stood by my side through everything." People clapped. My hands met once, then fell back to my lap. But he continued, and something in the way he said, but sounded like he had rehearsed it 1,000 times. "I have to confess something tonight. Something Evelyn deserves to hear, even if it costs me everything." A few people chuckled uncomfortably, assuming a punchline was coming. I did not. "My dear Evelyn," he said, turning to me, "I've wronged you in a way I can't take back. For most of our marriage, I lived another life, with someone else." The room went still. No cutlery clinked. No one breathed. I've been legally married to another woman for 40 years. We have a home. She knows nothing of this, nothing of you. And you deserve the truth before I go." He stepped back. I blinked. I think the chandelier above us trembled first, then me. I did not cry. I did not scream. I stood up, and I raised my glass. To the man I said, who kept time like a metronome. 2 lives. 2 wives. Perfect symmetry. People gasped. Someone dropped a fork. A couple awkwardly excused themselves toward the exit. But I kept smiling, serene, steady. He opened his mouth, perhaps expecting forgiveness. Perhaps expecting applause for finally telling me after a lifetime of silence. But I simply turned to my daughter Lillian and whispered, "He thinks this is over." That night I did not sleep. I opened the old chest in the attic, the one with our wedding album, birth certificates, his pension files, pieces of a life I thought I understood. I sifted through every page with gloved hands, searching for fractures in the paper trail I once believed in. And I found them. A notarized signature dated 5 months before our wedding. A credit card statement from a city he'd claimed to despise. A withdrawal made every 3rd Friday for over 3 decades. I sat in the attic until the light turned blue and the robins began to sing. And with their song, something in me hardened. I had been his symphony, his harmony, the backdrop music to his double act. But now I would be his crescendo. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in 20 years. Julia Morales, now an attorney in family law. I left a message. "It's Evelyn Marchand. I need help." And Julia, I don't want to scream. I want to destroy him with silence and the law. She called back an hour later. She only asked one question. "How deep do you want to go?" As deep as he did, I said. "Deeper." I met Julia in her law office on Ashbury Lane, a quiet building with frosted glass and polished wooden floors that creaked under secrets. She'd once been my student. Back then, she had shaky fingers on piano keys, always rushing the tempo. Now her fingers flipped through legal documents with surgical precision. She offered me coffee, but I declined. My hands needed to stay steady. She leaned forward. "Evelyn, I'll need everything. Dates, documents, memories, even things that don't seem important." "Can betrayal be organized chronologically?" I asked softly. She smiled, just a flicker. "Legally, yes." So I began. I opened my life like a ledger. I told her how Richard, my husband, would take monthly business trips to Portland, how I thought nothing of the recurring pattern. Consulting work, he said. I even helped pack his bags, wrote little notes to put in his shirts. I told her how he once came home with a faint lipstick smudge on his collar and said it was from a congratulatory colleague. I believed him. Back then I wanted to. And then I handed her the first clue. I'd uncovered the notarized marriage certificate from 1972, 5 months before we were wed. The name on the document sent a chill through me. Margot L. Bennett, born in Seattle, married to Richard Marchand. No mention of divorce. No annulment. Julia frowned. He never dissolved this marriage. Apparently not. He just duplicated. Over the next week, Julia built a map of deceit. With my help, she collected flight records, utility bills, bank statements, all triangulating a separate life. It was surgical. He wasn't sloppy. No paper trail overlapped. He'd used alias P. O. Boxes, cash payments, and Margot's maiden name for some utility bills. But there were cracks. Men like Richard who think they orchestrate everything always leave a missed beat somewhere. I want to meet her, I said one afternoon, staring at the wall-length corkboard Julia had built in her office. Evelyn, you don't owe her anything. I'm not doing it for her. I'm doing it for me. We traced Margot to a small house in Bainbridge Island, a modest 2-bedroom cottage covered in ivy. I made the ferry trip alone. The woman who opened the door looked exactly how I'd feared, and somehow, not at all. She was tall with pale blonde hair pulled into a bun, wearing an oversized cardigan and rubber gardening gloves. She looked startled but not scared. Yes, she asked. Is Richard home? I said gently. She blinked. He's at a conference in Dallas. Of course he was. I'm Evelyn, I said. I was his wife. I still am. She stared at me. Her lips trembled. Excuse me. I'm not here to scream or blame, I added. I just wanted to see your face, to understand. She let me in. The house was quiet, filled with antique furniture and piano sheet music. Chopin again. That broke something inside me. She poured tea. We sat at opposite ends of her kitchen table. I didn't know about you, she said, finally her voice tight. And I didn't know about you until last week. I married him in 1972. He said he traveled for work. Always did. So did he, I whispered. She looked down at her hands. He never missed our anniversary. Neither ours? We sat in silence, 2 lives built on the same lie. She asked if I planned to go to court. I do, I said. And I intend for it to be public. She nodded. Then, unexpectedly, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'll cooperate, she said. I'll testify. I looked into her eyes and saw not a rival, but a woman just like me, deceived, fractured, unfinished. Back in Julia's office, I recounted the meeting. She'll stand with us, I said. She wants the truth out as much as I do. Julia tilted her head. Then we build not just a legal case, but a human one. We make it undeniable. No jury in the world will forgive him once they hear it all. The plan began to take shape. We'd open with bigamy, a criminal offense. Then emotional fraud, financial deceit, reputation damage. Every layer peeled back with precision. But the heart of the case wasn't about money. It was about identity. I'd spent 50 years being someone's second choice without knowing it. I wouldn't let that be my final act. I want the trial public, I said again. Full exposure. Let the whispers echo. Julia nodded slowly. He'll try to settle. He'll beg you not to go forward. Let him, I said. Because what Richard didn't realize, what he never imagined, was that the woman who once played lullabies in his study was now ready to perform a requiem in court. And this time it would be his name written in minor key. Richard tried to reach me 3 times the following week. Once by email, just a line of apology and a plea to talk privately. Once through Lillian, who said he'd stopped by her house unannounced, trying to play the weary old man who just made a terrible mistake. And once by letter, a handwritten letter, the kind he hadn't sent me since the early days of our courtship. I didn't read it. I slid it into a manila envelope marked Exhibit C. Julia smiled when I brought it in. This is your silence speaking volumes. Meanwhile, Margot had begun forwarding additional information from her end pictures. documents, even a few old voicemails where Richard's excuses sounded eerily similar to the ones he'd used on me. It was chilling. This wasn't a man who fell in love twice by accident. This was someone who had composed a symphony of lies, each verse carefully harmonized between two women who had no reason to doubt him. For decades. It was almost genius. Almost. But arrogance has a tempo of its own. And Richard had finally played offbeat. That week, Julia brought in a forensic accountant. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried 3 laptops. We met in a windowless conference room and he clicked through a timeline so complex it could have been a Cold War operation. Here, he said, highlighting a cluster of dates. See the pattern. Transfers to an offshore account in the Caymans. Names masked through shell entities. For what purpose? I asked. He shrugged. Slush fund. Possibly supporting the second household. Possibly more. Julia leaned in. We build a case on intent, not just deception. And intent here is undeniable. We were 6 weeks in, and I began to move through my days with surgical focus. My friends, my students, even my daughter could sense something had shifted in me. I wasn't angry in the traditional sense. I wasn't outwardly sad. I was resolute. Like someone who had spent a lifetime polishing glass and now suddenly found it weaponized. At night, I'd sit at my old upright piano and play the same piece over and over, Bach's Prelude in C major. A simple melody, but with such intricate structure beneath the surface. I imagined each note as a courtroom line, each chord a revelation. It helped me think. One night, as I reached the final measures, I heard the front gate creak. I knew it was him. I waited until he knocked. 3 taps. Hesitant. I opened the door just enough to let him see my face. Evelyn, he whispered. Please, don't beg. It doesn't suit you. I didn't tell you to hurt you, but you did. And now you're going to hear it echoed through marble walls and legal transcripts. He looked tired. Older. I studied his face the way one studies an artifact, recognizing the history, but no longer feeling its power. I was going to tell you years ago. But you didn't. You waited until the attention would make it feel like a brave act. He said nothing. I continued. You had 2 lives, but only 1 legacy. And I intend to carve that legacy into every page of court record. He reached into his coat pocket, probably for another letter. I closed the door. Behind me, my metronome clicked on the piano lid. Tick, tick, tick. He left. The next morning, Julia filed the case in King County Superior Court. Full exposure. Charges of bigamy, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We requested open proceedings. The press picked it up within a day. The headline read, Double Marriage Exposed. 50-year wife takes husband to court on golden anniversary. The local radio station called me for comment. I gave them a single line. Sometimes the quietest women carry the sharpest truths. Richard's lawyer, a man with slick hair and a voice like melted plastic, reached out for mediation. Julia laughed. No. A week later, Margot signed her deposition. I believed I was his only wife, she wrote. I was deceived for 40 years. Richard was served the next morning at a cafe. He was eating a croissant. When the process server slid the envelope across the table, he reportedly said nothing. Just stared at the paper, then back at his coffee as if the foam might suddenly offer him an escape clause. But this wasn't fiction. This was legal opera, and it was about to reach its crescendo. That evening, I played Rachmaninoff. Even my hands trembled with purpose. The courthouse loomed like a cathedral of reckoning, its limestone facade basked in the gray Pacific morning. Tall columns like silent witnesses to 1,000 quiet devastations. I stood outside, my coat, buttoned hair swept back, a folder of evidence tucked neatly beneath my arm. Not one paper was out of place. Neither was I. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I expected. Intimate. The kind of place where lies echoed louder because they had fewer places to hide. Julia stood beside me, calm, clipped, razor sharp. She handed me a copy of the witness list and whispered, Today is about precision, not passion. I nodded, though my pulse had a rhythm all its own. Richard entered last. He wore a navy suit just slightly frayed at the cuffs, an imperfection he would have once scorned. His eyes flickered toward me for a moment, but I didn't meet them. I focused instead on the courtroom clock. Tick, tick, tick. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with salt-streaked hair and eyes like polished slate, called the court to order. And the opening began. Julia started not with theatrics, but with structure. She presented the timelines, the overlapping marital records, the financial ties, the photos, one by one. A duet of fact and silence. Her voice was cool and precise, never rising, never cracking. Then she introduced Margot's deposition. A gasp rippled when the second marriage certificate was placed on the screen. Not because it was forged, but because it was real. The date stamped in ink. The witness signatures, the vows he made before mine. That was when the courtroom started shifting, when the story stopped being about a misunderstanding and started becoming what it really was. Deception layered over decades, buried under birthday cards and piano recitals. I watched Richard closely. He kept his face a perfect mask, an old skill of his. But every so often his hand twitched at the cuff, or his tongue ran across his teeth. Tells like a gambler with a losing hand. Then Julia introduced the evidence I had quietly gathered. A bank statement with recurring transfers to Margot's address. A postcard he once sent to her from Prague during a month he'd told me he was on retreat in the mountains. An airline rewards profile under a second email, alias registered the same year we celebrated our 25th anniversary. Then the photos. 2 Christmas trees, 2 separate houses. Same man, same week, same smile. The courtroom fell into silence, not discomfort. Awe! And then Margot entered. She had decided to testify in person. She wore a gray dress, hair in a bun, hands folded in her lap, like a woman raised on etiquette and disbelief. The courtroom watched her ascend the stand. She took a breath and said, "I loved a man for 40 years who I thought was mine. I now understand he never truly belonged to anyone." The judge leaned forward. Margot continued, "He told me he was sterile, which is why we never had children. Imagine my surprise when I learned he had 2. With Evelyn." Another gasp. Richard's composure wavered. For a split second, he looked like a child caught stealing. Not sorry, just exposed. Julia turned toward the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "the law calls this bigamy, but the human heart calls it cruelty." When the court recessed for lunch, reporters were already gathered outside. Microphones flashing cameras, questions shouted across the stone steps. I didn't speak to them. Instead, I walked down the hall and into the women's restroom, locked myself in the last stall, and let my shoulders collapse, not from grief, but from the weight of finally laying everything bare. It wasn't until I looked down at my shoes, polished steady, that I realized I wasn't shaking. I was grounded. Back in session, Richard's lawyer took the floor. He tried to reframe it all as a tragic romantic misjudgment, an emotional complication that had spiraled. He used words like remorse and regret, and the complexity of love. But Julia was ready. She played one last piece. A voicemail Richard had left Margot, saved from 2 years ago. In it he said, "You're the only one I've ever truly loved. The other life, it's just noise. I only stay for appearances." The judge raised an eyebrow. I didn't flinch. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was betrayal amplified, recorded, archived in digital sound. And this was only the beginning, because tomorrow I would take the stand. The next morning, I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, fastening the same pearl earrings I wore the day Richard proposed. I remember thinking they felt heavier now, not because of time, but because of the weight of what they'd silently witnessed. Outside, the sky was a soft watercolor gray, the kind of morning that didn't promise sunshine, but didn't dare threaten rain. A perfect balance, just like I needed to be. At the courthouse, the air buzzed not with noise, but anticipation. A local paper had run the headline, "Golden Anniversary Turns to Courtroom Drama. Evelyn Marchand to testify today." I walked into the courtroom without looking at the cameras, without looking at Richard, without fear. The clerk swore me in. I took the stand. The microphone clicked on. Julia began, her voice gentler now. "Mrs. Marchand, how long were you married to the defendant?" 50 years, I said. Though I suppose the math is flexible depending on which wife you ask. A ripple of muffled laughter ran through the gallery. The judge didn't stop it. "And when did you learn of the second marriage?" On our golden anniversary, he confessed in front of our family. Our friends. Over crème brûlée. Julia paused. Can you describe what you felt in that moment? I looked at the judge first, then at the jury. Have you ever been at a concert, I said, where the symphony swells and the strings reach that perfect high note, and then suddenly snap, and all you hear is silence, but your ears are still ringing. A long pause. That's what it felt like. I saw the bailiff shift uncomfortably, as if even he had to sit with the silence that followed. Julia continued. What did you do next? I smiled, I said. I made a toast. Then I began building a case. Why? Because anger fades. But truth. I turned my gaze to Richard. Truth stays on record. She asked me to describe our marriage, its routines, its supposed milestones, the way he traveled the way he always had, 2 cell phones, one for work, one for emergencies. The way he had a second apartment in Portland I never saw. The way our anniversary gifts always came a week late with an excuse so well practiced I stopped questioning. Then she asked the question I'd been expecting. Why didn't you confront him that night? I straightened in my seat. Because pain isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits with you like a guest at the table. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of chaos. I wanted justice. And justice requires clarity. Julia nodded, turned to the judge. No further questions. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights buzz. Then it was Richard's lawyer's turn. He walked slowly, overconfident. He smiled like someone about to pull the rug out. Mrs. Marchand, he began. You seem quite composed. I tilted my head. Would you prefer I be hysterical? He chuckled. Not at all. It's just that, after such a betrayal, your response seems rather cold. I let that sit. My response is disciplined, I said, not cold. There's a difference. I've spent 50 years managing someone else's version of love. I won't spend another second managing anyone's expectations of my grief. He cleared his throat. But surely, you must have had some suspicion over the years. Isn't it true that you turned a blind eye? I leaned forward, voice calm. No, I turned toward the life I was promised. I trusted a man who looked me in the eye every day and called me his only one. That isn't blindness. That's betrayal wearing a tuxedo. There was no rebuttal. He looked down at his notes, fumbled for a moment, then mumbled, no further questions. As I stepped down from the witness box, I felt every eye in the room on me, not with pity, but with respect. Even the court reporter paused before resuming her typing. Richard stared straight ahead. I could feel his anger boiling beneath that rigid posture, not because I'd humiliated him, but because I'd refused to break. Later that day, as we left the courthouse, Julia turned to me and said, You were magnificent. I wasn't performing, I replied. And I meant it. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about record. Tomorrow, Margot would take the stand, and for the first time in her life, just like me, she would speak not as a wife, but as a witness. And together, our voices would burn down the myth of the man who thought he could choreograph 2 lives in the shadows. Because when 2 women tell the same truth, there's nowhere left for a lie to hide. The next morning, Margot arrived early. She wore a navy blue coat, her hair pinned back tightly. I saw her waiting on the courthouse steps before anyone else had arrived, holding a plain leather clutch in both hands like it anchored her. When I walked up beside her, she didn't look at me. We simply stood shoulder to shoulder, 2 women who had unknowingly shared a life. I've never testified before, she said quietly. You don't have to be perfect, I replied. You just have to be honest. She nodded once and we walked in together. Inside the gallery was fuller than it had been on previous days. Word had spread. The betrayal had gone viral in our sleepy community, passed from cafe corners to dinner tables. People weren't just curious anymore. They were invested. The court clerk called her name. She took the oath with a voice that trembled slightly, but her hands did not. Julia approached gently, aware of the emotional minefield ahead. Miss Bennett, how long were you married to the defendant, Mr. Richard Marchand? 40 years, Margot replied. And during those 40 years, did you ever suspect that he had another wife? No, Margot said firmly. He told me he had no living family, that his parents were gone, no siblings, no children. He said I was his entire world. Julia gave the jury a moment to absorb that. Were you ever invited to his workplace events? Did you ever meet his colleagues? No, she replied. He said his consulting firm was very private. Confidential clients. I believed him. Julia paced slowly, letting each answer land like a stone in still water. Miss Bennett, did you and Mr. Marchand ever try to start a family? A pause. Margot swallowed. Yes, I miscarried once. After that, he said we should stop trying. That he couldn't have children. From the gallery, I heard someone exhale sharply. I didn't turn to see who. Julia nodded. And how did you feel when you discovered that wasn't true? Margot's voice cracked for the first time. I felt erased. Silence again. Can you describe what you saw when you learned of Mrs. Marchand and her family? She looked at me then. Right at me. I saw wedding photos, birth announcements, Christmases, vacations, a full life. And I realized I'd been living in half-light for 40 years. The courtroom was frozen. Julia asked a final question. Do you believe the defendant intended to deceive you? Margot nodded slowly, tears in her eyes but not falling. I don't think he ever meant to be honest. I think he meant to die with the secret still buried. No further questions. When the defense attorney approached, there was a stiffness in his stride. He knew better than to antagonize a grieving woman. But he had a job to do. Ms. Bennett, is it possible that Mr. Marchand was simply confused? That he didn't know how to untangle himself from past mistakes? Margot's face hardened in an instant. Sir, confused is forgetting where you parked your car. Living two lives for 4 decades. That's choreography. The jury stirred. He tried again. But surely you benefited from this deception financially, emotionally? Didn't you receive love, a home, stability? I received fiction, she snapped. Don't dress that up in silk. He backed off. As Margot stepped down, she walked past Richard's table without a glance. He looked up, perhaps hoping for some glimmer of sympathy. There was none. The judge called for recess and Julia and I stepped outside. Margot joined us moments later, standing in the sun with a stunned expression. I thought it would break me, she said. It doesn't, I replied. It burns first. Then it builds. Later that evening, Lillian came by my house with a bag of groceries. She stood at the door uncertain. I didn't know how much to say before she admitted. I didn't want to take sides. But now, she looked down. I can't believe he lied to you. To us. I nodded. He wasn't just my husband, Lily. He was your father. And I'm sorry the image is broken now. But the truth is better than a myth. She embraced me tightly and I felt her sob against my shoulder. Not for what she lost, but for what she had never fully known. The next day, Julia called. The press wants an interview, she said. No, I replied. Let the courtroom speak. But inside I knew something had shifted. We weren't just witnesses anymore. We were architects of truth. And soon Richard would face the part he never composed for. The verdict. The morning of the final trial week arrived with an eerie stillness. Even the wind outside seemed subdued, as though the world itself held its breath. Inside the courthouse, every chair in the gallery was filled. Some faces I recognized: old students, distant cousins, neighbors who had once admired Richard's charm at garden parties. Others were strangers drawn in by headlines and whispers. But I didn't walk in for them. I walked in for the woman I used to be, the one who played Chopin in the living room, while her husband made calls in another room, laughing softly in a voice she mistook for warmth. The court proceedings began with Julia's closing evidence, an annotated timeline spanning 5 decades shown on a large screen. Each key event in Richard's 2 marriages, birthdays, missed anniversaries, double-booked fake business trips was color-coded and synchronized. It looked like a war strategy, and in a way it was. The forensic accountant returned to the stand and confirmed the financials. 2 separate tax profiles, 2 household budgets, and nearly $400,000 funneled through unreported accounts over a decade. Intentional concealment, he repeated. Not mistake. Not oversight. Then came the final exhibit. A photograph of Richard taken only 6 months before the trial. 2 women, Margot and I, were cropped out of the frame. But he stood between us, arms extended in either direction, one hand on each of our shoulders, smiling. It was taken at a university alumni event in Seattle. He had invited us both separately. We never saw each other there. But the photograph didn't lie. A lie with a shutter speed of 1500th of a second. The jury stared. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then the defense began their last desperate play. His attorney, who now looked more weathered than confident, called Richard to the stand. He walked slowly, carefully, as if each step could still undo what had been built against him. He sat down, raised his hand, swore the oath, then spoke. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said, voice low. "I loved both women. I know that sounds impossible, but it's true. Evelyn gave me structure. Margot gave me escape. I didn't plan for this to last. I was going to choose. I just never did. There it was. Not remorse. Not apology. Cowardice wrapped in self-pity." Julia leaned back, arms folded. She didn't need to object. He was doing her work for her. Richard continued. "There were moments I wanted to confess. But I thought if I could just hold it together, no one would get hurt." He looked at me then, directly. "I never stopped loving you, Evelyn." I didn't blink. Because I wasn't the same woman anymore. After a long pause, the judge called a break before final arguments. I walked into the hallway alone. A woman approached me, early 30s. Red lipstick, furrowed brow. "Are you Evelyn Marchand?" she asked. "Yes." I just wanted to say, "Thank you for doing this. My mother went through something similar, but she never got to speak." I nodded once. She disappeared into the crowd. That's when I knew. This story was no longer just mine. Back inside, Julia gave her closing. She spoke of betrayal not as a personal failing, but as a community fracture. "This isn't about love triangles," she said. "It's about trust desecrated over decades. It's about a man who used two lives as mirrors to reflect his own ego and never once stopped to see the cost." Then she paused. And the women who stood in that shadow, they didn't crumble. They stood up. They testified. They showed us all what truth looks like when spoken in a quiet, steady voice. She sat down. The courtroom was still. The judge turned to the jury. "You've heard the testimonies, the documents, the voices. You are now tasked with deciding not just the legality, but the morality of this case." 12 people stood. They filed out. And for the first time in weeks, there was nothing to do but wait. Outside, clouds gathered. Inside, so did the weight of every moment leading to this one. Margot sat beside me. She didn't speak. She just reached over and took my hand. And I let her, because now we weren't wives. We were witnesses. The jury was gone for 3 hours. I'd heard stories of deliberations stretching overnight, even into the next week. But somehow I knew this wouldn't take long. Not because the case was simple. Nothing about betrayal is simple. But because the evidence had spoken with such cold mathematical clarity. There was no ambiguity left to protect him. Julia sat across from me in the waiting lounge, sipping black coffee from a courthouse cup. Margot paced in slow, methodical loops near the window. I sat still, watching the condensation run down the pane, wondering how many women over the centuries had waited for verdicts like this. Not all in courtrooms, perhaps, but in kitchens, in bedrooms, in conversations with priests or daughters or diaries, waiting for a world that had wronged them to finally say, "You were right." At 2:47 p.m., the bailiff returned. "The jury has reached a verdict." I stood up, adjusted the brooch on my lapel, the one Richard gave me for our 10th anniversary. I had thought it was a symbol of permanence. Now I wore it as proof of irony. The courtroom filled again, press in the back, murmurs behind cupped hands, every seat taken. The judge entered. We rose. We sat. The foreperson, a woman with short silver hair and a purple scarf, stood. She held the verdict form like it was made of glass. "In the matter of Evelyn Marchand versus Richard Marchand regarding the charge of bigamy," she paused. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A wave of breath rippled through the room. The foreperson continued. "In the matter of emotional damages and intentional fraud, guilty. And in the matter of punitive financial damages to the plaintiff, Evelyn Marchand, in light of sustained deception and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $1, $2 million in restitution." The judge nodded once. "This court finds Mr. Richard Marchand in violation of both legal and moral statutes. Sentencing will proceed next month. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. People began whispering instantly, but I didn't hear them. Not really. I looked at Richard. He sat still as if the words had passed through him like fog. But something was gone now. The performance, the mask. What remained was just a man, small, tired, disassembled by truth. Julia leaned toward me and whispered, "It's done." But I knew better. The trial might be over, but some wounds don't close with a verdict. After the hearing, Margot and I stood together on the courthouse steps. The sky had opened, soft drizzle falling on the marble on our coats on the flash of cameras. "What will you do now?" she asked. I'm not sure, I admitted. I may finally learn how to grow orchids. She smiled, though her eyes stayed far away. I'm going to change my last name back. We both laughed, quiet and knowing. A reporter pushed forward, voice eager. "Mrs. Marchand, do you have any comment now that justice has been served?" I looked straight into the camera, and I said, "Justice isn't a destination. It's a beginning." Then I turned, walked down the steps and out into the rain. That night, I returned home to a house that felt unfamiliar and sacred. I made tea in the kitchen, placed a Chopin record on the turntable, and sat by the window as it spun. My phone buzzed. Messages poured in. Old students, friends from conservatory, women I hadn't spoken to in decades. One read, "You gave us all a voice today. Thank you." I looked at the message, then turned off the phone. This story was never about revenge. It was about dignity, about stepping into the light after a lifetime lived in someone else's shadow, about playing your own song, in your own key, at your own tempo. And as the rain tapped softly on the glass, I realized, for the first time in 50 years, I was finally alone, and that meant I was finally free. The weeks following the verdict were filled with the kind of silence I hadn't known in decades. Not the silence of denial or avoidance, the kind that had blanketed our house every time Richard returned from a business trip with tired eyes and no explanation. No, this silence was different. It was whole. It was earned. I stayed in the house for the time being. Friends encouraged me to move to start fresh, but I wasn't ready. Every creaking floorboard and dented bookshelf held echoes of truth, and I wasn't going to be the one to run from them. Let Richard live in exile. This place was mine now, not because he gave it to me, but because I had reclaimed it. One morning, I stood in my bedroom, looking through the closet. I pulled out the garment bag that had protected my wedding dress all these years. Ivory silk, high-necked with lace trim, I'd chosen with trembling fingers 5 decades ago. I laid it across the bed, smoothed the fabric flat, and simply stared. It looked so small, as if it had shrunk under the weight of the years. I didn't cry. Instead, I folded it up and placed it in a box labeled "Donations." Somewhere, perhaps, another woman would get a new beginning. A true one. Meanwhile, the media had moved on to other stories. The headlines faded, but something strange happened. I began receiving letters. Dozens, then hundreds. Some handwritten, others typed and folded into floral stationery. All from women, some strangers, some not sharing their own versions of betrayal, their own private trials. Some had fought back, some hadn't. But all of them ended the same way. "Thank you for telling the truth." It gave me permission to stop pretending. It wasn't justice in the legal sense. It was something deeper. One envelope stood out. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Margot. Inside was a simple note. "Evelyn, I finally signed the divorce papers. It's over. I'm heading to Nova Scotia for the summer. There's a coastal cottage there that used to belong to my aunt. I'm not sure who I'll be on the other side of this, but I'd like to find out. If you're ever near, come visit. M." I folded the note carefully and placed it on my piano. I didn't know if I'd ever see her again, but I was glad she was beginning again. We were both in our own ways walking out of the fog. And then came the sentencing hearing. I didn't attend. Julia went on my behalf, and when she returned to my house that evening, she brought a copy of the court's decision. Richard was given a suspended sentence, probation, public restitution, and permanent notation on his record for bigamy and fraud. He wouldn't go to jail, but he would never practice again, never work in finance, never remarry legally without a flashing red warning attached to his name. He was at last truly alone. "Did he say anything?" I asked. Julia nodded, smirking. He asked if you still played piano. I stared at her. He said, she added. I never understood how she played such sad music with such steady hands. I looked at the fireplace. At the mantel where our family portraits used to be. I had replaced them all, not with new photos, but with landscapes, mountains, rivers, wild, untouched places. He still doesn't understand, I murmured. It was never sadness. It was strength. She smiled. Exactly. We sipped wine that night, and I told her stories I hadn't told anyone in years about my time in Paris. My dream of composing the unfinished sheet music tucked into a drawer in my study. You should write again, she said. I just might, I replied. A few weeks later, I booked a ticket to Nova Scotia. I packed light, just a small suitcase, a leather notebook, and a scarf that had once been Margot's, passed to me at the end of the trial in a quiet, symbolic moment of closure. Before I left, I visited the courthouse one last time, not for a case, not for press, just for me. I walked through the empty hallways, letting my footsteps echo. I paused in front of the courtroom door, and then I whispered, "Thank you." Not to the judge, not to the jury, not even to Julia, but to myself, because I had done what I never thought I could. I had rewritten the ending, and not just for me, but for every woman who had ever been told her silence was strength. It isn't. Truth is, Nova Scotia greeted me with wind sharp, salty, and bracing. It rolled in from the sea like an ancient language speaking of storms weathered and stories buried in the tides. As the small taxi bumped along the gravel road toward the cottage, Margot mentioned I watched the world become simpler. The trees taller, the houses fewer, the silence deeper. The cottage sat on a bluff, whitewashed and weather-worn, its shutters flaking blue paint. There were wild roses at the base of the porch steps and gulls circling overhead. I stepped out, suitcase in hand, and for the first time in my adult life, felt unaccounted for. No one knew where I was. No one needed anything. No expectations. No image to uphold. Just Evelyn. Margot was inside barefoot, humming to herself as she made tea. When she turned and saw me in the doorway, she smiled, not politely, not awkwardly, just truly. You came, she said. I wasn't sure I would. I admitted. Neither was I, she replied. But I'm glad you did. We spent the afternoon walking along the coast in heavy sweaters, wind pressing against our faces, not talking much. We didn't need to. We had already spoken our truth in front of a judge, a jury, and a world that had never expected us to raise our voices. Later that evening, seated on her porch overlooking the sea, Margot lit a small fire in a stone pit and poured us both glasses of red wine. The stars emerged slowly, one by one, blinking like shy children. I kept asking myself, she said, what did I miss? Was it something I didn't do? Something I should have known? I nodded. I asked myself the same thing, until I realized we were never part of his plan. We were props in a story he was writing for himself. Margot's eyes were glossy but dry. I gave him my best years. You gave him your loyalty, I said. He didn't know what to do with it. She leaned back and exhaled. Do you still love him? Even now? I considered the question seriously. I loved who I believed he was, I said. But that man never existed. And I've decided I won't spend the rest of my life mourning a phantom. She gave a soft laugh. Good answer. We clinked our glasses. That night, I stayed in the guest bedroom, a small room with lace curtains and a view of the moonlit sea. I couldn't sleep. Not because of unrest, but because my mind was filled with possibility. It had been years since I felt that. Decades. So I did something I hadn't done in over 30 years. I composed. With pencil and paper pulled from my suitcase, I sat at a tiny writing desk and began sketching melodies. Not for anyone else. Not for performance. Just to remember what it felt like to create something unfiltered. In the weeks that followed, I found a rhythm. Mornings spent on walks. Afternoons writing. Evenings by the fire with Margot trading stories. Not about Richard anymore, but about ourselves. Our childhoods. Our dreams. The things we never said out loud because there had never been time. One evening, Margot showed me a letter she'd written but never sent to her younger self. You won't believe how much you're capable of enduring. You won't believe who you'll become after betrayal. but I promise you the woman on the other side is stronger. And free. I asked if I could write one too. She handed me a pen. I stared at the blank paper for a long time. Then I wrote, "Dear Evelyn, they told you silence was grace. They were wrong. Your voice is your compass. Your truth is your song." We pinned the letters to the corkboard in her kitchen. Testaments, not to survival, but to reclamation. One afternoon, I received an email from Lillian. A photo was attached to my granddaughter at her school recital holding a violin with fierce pride. I told her you used to perform in concert halls. The message read, "She says she wants to be just like you. Not just the music, the bravery." I pressed a hand to my mouth. For so long I had thought my legacy was what Richard and I built together. But now I saw the truth. My legacy had nothing to do with him. It was in my daughter's spine, in my granddaughter's hands, in the music I was writing again, in the quiet steps Margot and I took along that rugged coastline. And most of all, it was in the story I had chosen to tell and the silence I had finally broken. Fall crept slowly into Nova Scotia, dyeing the coastline in amber and rust. The air sharpened, the sea turned moodier, and the roses beneath Margot's porch finally gave in to the cold. I stayed through the shift. Something inside me needed to witness the season change completely before I could move again. Perhaps I needed to know that I could change too. Margot had taken up painting. She wasn't very good, she admitted with a laugh, but she liked the brushstrokes, the sense that each one was a decision irreversible and wholly her own. I encouraged her. "Keep painting," I said. "Even the messes are yours." I finished the first piece of music I'd written in over 30 years. It was not dramatic. It did not build to a sweeping crescendo. It was quiet, steady, thoughtful, a meditation in minor chords. I titled it 50 and 1, 50 years of deception, 1 year of truth. I mailed the score to my granddaughter with a note. "Play it slowly, and know that every note is a step forward." Then one morning, an envelope arrived at the cottage. The return address, Richard Marchand. I stared at it for a long time, the way one might stare at a dead branch still clinging to a tree after winter. Useless. But there, inside was a single sheet of cream paper with his familiar clipped handwriting. "Evelyn, I won't ask for forgiveness. I know I've forfeited that. But I do want you to know that I'm leaving the country. I've signed over the deed to the Seattle house to you. There's no contest. You earned everything in that life, and I earned my exile. I hope you find peace." I read the note once. Then I tore it in half, not out of rage, out of ritual. It was my final act of letting go, not to punish him, but to free myself. From the shadows of apology, from the echoes of excuses, I walked down to the shore and tossed the pieces into the sea. Let the tide carry it. Let the salt eat it. Later that week, Margot and I talked about what came next. "I think I'll stay here through the winter," she said, gazing out the kitchen window. "Then maybe I'll sell, or maybe I'll stay forever. Maybe I'll visit again," I said, "or maybe I won't." We smiled at each other. Neither hurt, neither holding on too tightly, because we had learned something vital. Closure isn't about holding hands at the end. It's about knowing when to let go without bitterness, without fear. Before I left, Margot handed me a parting gift, one of her paintings. It was a watercolor. 2 women standing on a bluff backs to the viewer looking out at the horizon. The sea wild beneath them, the sky stitched with clouds. She had signed it with just one word. Witnesses. I returned to Seattle with less than I came with. No husband, no shared home, no illusions. But I had more too. A manuscript of original music, a painting, a name that meant something again. Evelyn Marchand, not Richard's wife, not the woman behind the curtain, just Evelyn. I moved into a modest apartment downtown. High ceilings, a bay window, a second-hand upright piano. I took up teaching again, just one student to start. A young girl named Zoe, with a gap in her front teeth, and an eagerness that made me want to cry. "I want to learn something dramatic," she told me on our first day. So I gave her the first 2 measures of 50 and 1. She played them slow, tender, serious. And I realized, healing isn't always grand. Sometimes it's just one note played honestly, one truth spoken plainly, one step taken alone on steady legs. December rolled into Seattle like a sigh fog curling along the rooftops' holiday lights, blinking like afterthoughts in the mist. My new apartment overlooked a park where children shouted through their scarves, and old couples held hands as if winter had reminded them that warmth was something to be shared. I walked often, sometimes with no destination, just the rhythm of my steps echoing against the pavement like a metronome. It was strange to move without an agenda, to live without an orbit around someone else's needs. Strange and beautiful. The Seattle house was officially mine, now the title transferred and uncontested. I didn't go back. Instead, I donated most of the furniture. I kept a few things. The baby grand piano, the brass lamp from my first recital, and a box of family photos I planned to reframe with just the people who belonged in them. No ghosts. No placeholders. One afternoon, I found a letter waiting in my mailbox, not from Richard this time, but from his brother Franklin. We'd spoken perhaps twice in 20 years. He had always seemed embarrassed by Richard's arrogance, but distant like a man watching a shipwreck from shore. The letter was brief. Evelyn, I never knew the extent of what Richard had done. I believed the myth like everyone else. I'm ashamed I didn't see more. But I wanted you to know. Your testimony opened more than a courtroom. It opened eyes, mine included. I folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box labeled Truths. A new box slowly filling, not with lies, not with romantic souvenirs, but with moments of clarity, of return, of reclaimed ground. Zoe, my young student, had come far in a few months. She played 50 and 1 in full, now soft fingers exploring the quiet notes with wonder. Her mother watched from the doorway during lessons, sometimes crying without making a sound. One day, Zoe asked, "Did you write this because you were sad?" I thought for a moment. I wrote it because I was done being silent. She nodded like she understood, even if she didn't yet. Children often grasp truth instinctively before they know how to name it. Margot and I kept in touch. Letters mostly. Honest, simple updates. She sent me a photograph of the coast in winter, the ocean frozen in part snow covering the wild roses. On the back she had written, "We bloomed, Evelyn, even in frost." I pinned it on the corkboard in my study beside the score of 50 and 1 and my letter to my younger self. A quiet wall of survival, a mosaic of becoming. Sometimes I still heard Richard's voice in memory, not lovingly, more like a faded radio station you didn't mean to tune into. He had been my entire life for so long. But now he was just a former character in a story I no longer reread. That winter, I began working on a second composition. Not a sequel, but a companion piece. I called it Witness. It was different, bolder, with unexpected chords and long silences in between. The kind of music that made you sit still, that refused to let you multitask. Because truth is like that. It doesn't scream. It waits. I submitted the piece to a small community recital series. The program director called 2 weeks later. "I was moved," she said. "It's rare to find something so unflinching." I smiled into the receiver. It wasn't always music. And it wasn't. It had been testimony. It had been stillness. It had been walking away, not running. And it had been telling a story no one wanted to believe until the evidence sang louder than the denial. Now people listened, not because I demanded it, but because I had earned it. Spring arrived gently like a curtain being drawn back. The cherry blossoms along the Seattle streets bloomed in sudden, reckless pink, scattering petals across sidewalks like confetti from some invisible celebration. I watched them from my bay window each morning with tea in hand and a notebook open beside me. My second composition, Witness, had been accepted into the community concert series. It would be performed at St. Elias Hall, a modest venue with arched ceilings and acoustics that caught even the softest note and carried it as if it were sacred. I hadn't stepped onto a stage in over 20 years, not since my final public recital at the conservatory. That night, Richard had stood backstage, flowers in hand, pride in his voice. Now I would step onto that stage without him, without anyone defining what that applause should mean. A week before the performance, I received a letter in thick ivory paper, hand-addressed. It was from Margot. "Evelyn, I've sold the cottage. I'll be traveling for a while. First to Lisbon, then who knows? But I wanted you to have something before I go." The envelope includes the final painting I made before packing my brushes. It's not perfect, but it's real. Like us, M. Inside was a small canvas board. The painting showed two pianos in a sunlit room, one upright, one grand. On each sat a single cup of tea. No people, just presence, stillness. I smiled and placed it beside the others on my wall. I didn't need Margot's voice to be near. The silence between us had become a kind of language, all its own. The night of the performance, I wore black silk and a strand of pearls my mother's. I arrived early carrying nothing but the sheet music and a folded program. Backstage, a volunteer pianist offered to warm up the keys for me. "I've got it," I said. I sat down in the small green room and ran through each measure silently, my fingers dancing across invisible keys on my lap. When my name was announced, a murmur filled the audience. Some were likely there out of curiosity. This was the woman from the trial. The headline, "The Betrayal," but they didn't know the music. Not yet. I stepped onto the stage, not with fanfare, with intention. I bowed once, sat, and began to play. Witness didn't start with a flourish. It opened with silence, a full measure of pause, the kind that draws breath from the room. Then slowly the first chords, minor, resonant, deliberate. I had written it to echo the rhythm of truth, halting, trembling, then strong. Halfway through I felt something shift, not in the crowd, in me. I was not performing, I was remembering and rewriting. Each note restructured a part of my story, not to erase it, but to own it. The deception, the loss, the courtroom, the fire in Margot's eyes, the sea, the letters, the broken pearls of memory, all of it wove through the melody. When the final note rang out, a soft high tone held just long enough to let the silence return, I lifted my hands from the keys and exhaled. The room erupted. Applause thundered against the rafters, but I sat for a moment longer, hands in my lap as if still holding something fragile. Then I stood, not to be praised, to be seen. Later that evening, a young woman approached me during the reception, maybe 20, with a scarf knotted around her neck like armor. "That piece," she whispered it. It felt like being told I wasn't crazy. "You're not," I said. She wiped her eyes. "I didn't know music could say something like that." "It can," I said. "So can you?" I left the hall with sore fingers and a heart that felt 3 sizes too full. At home, I sat at the window watching the city lights flicker beneath a lavender sky. A single cherry blossom petal had lodged itself in the folds of my coat. I let it stay, because sometimes the most fragile things, truth, forgiveness, voice, are also the ones that last. By midsummer, Seattle had shed its gray shawl and dressed itself in sunlight. The market bustled with tourists. Children ran barefoot through the fountains, and the scent of roasted coffee beans drifted down every corner like an old friend. Life pulsed again, but not with urgency, with ease. I had started teaching a second student and then a third. Word spread that Mrs. Marchand, though, I gently corrected them to just, Evelyn was teaching again. Not for money, not for prestige, for the joy of watching hands learn the language of sound, of watching someone find confidence note by note. One evening, after a long day of lessons, I pulled open a drawer I hadn't opened in decades. It contained my old journals, tattered leather-bound volumes filled with memories, dreams, fears, and pages I had written during the earliest years of my marriage. I had forgotten they even existed. I flipped through one from 1973. One entry read, "Richard was quiet tonight. He said the Portland trip was stressful. I rubbed his shoulders and made soup. He said I make things better. I want to believe him. I do." I closed the book. I didn't cry, because that woman no longer needed my pity. She needed my respect. She had endured, and now I was giving her a voice she never thought she'd have. In July, I hosted a small salon recital in my apartment. Just a handful of students, their parents, and a few close friends. I moved the upright piano against the bay window and laid out lemon cake and tea on the counter. Margot sent a card in advance. "Play something reckless for me. Something that forgets the rules." M. I did. I played a new piece, unfinished, spontaneous, full of suspended chords and unexpected silence. The students sat wide-eyed. One parent whispered, "What was that called?" I smiled. "I haven't named it yet. Maybe you just heard its birth. That night, after the guests had left and the plates had been cleared, I sat alone on the floor, back against the wall, watching the city lights flicker like signals from a quieter world. I thought about all the things I had unlearned. Unlearned how to apologize for taking up space. Unlearned how to ignore instincts. Unlearned the reflex to soften my voice so someone else felt bigger. It had taken me 50 years to become free. But once free, I learned how quickly the self remembers who she was meant to be. I picked up a fresh sheet of music paper and began sketching another composition, this one brighter, almost playful. I called it Inheritance, not the kind written in wills, the kind earned in truth. 2 weeks later, I received a voicemail. It was from Richard's brother again. His voice was quieter this time. "Evelyn," he said, "I thought you should know Richard's gone. Heart failure. Quiet. No funeral planned per his request." He left a note. Just 2 lines. "I love them both, but I only gave one the truth." I sat with that for a long time. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel rage. I felt still, like a book closing softly after the final sentence. I didn't call Franklin back. There was nothing else to say. Richard had been the architect of his legacy, and his silence would echo unanswered in a world he could no longer orchestrate. The next morning, I stepped out into the bright summer air. I walked to the lake, sat on the bench beneath the willow tree where I used to read as a girl, and watched the water ripple like breath. I took out my journal and wrote a final note. He's gone, and I did not disappear with him. I remained, and I am no longer a wife or a victim or a quiet woman smiling through deception. I am a witness, and my voice carries. It was late August when I received the final letter. No envelope no postmark. Just a folded piece of parchment slipped under my apartment door with neat, familiar handwriting. Lillian. I unfolded it with trembling fingers, not from fear but from that sacred weight letters carry when they arrive after silence. Mom, I've been thinking about everything. About you. About Dad. About what love even means when it's built on a lie. For a long time I was angry not just at him but at you too. For staying. For smiling through it. I didn't understand how someone so brilliant could be fooled. But now I see you weren't fooled. You were committed. And when the truth came, you didn't collapse. You stood up and made the whole world look at it. I'm proud of you, more than I've ever said, and more than I'll ever stop saying. Love, Lillian. I read it twice, then a third time. Then I placed it inside the wooden truths box on top of Franklin's apology and Margot's painting sketch. Closure doesn't come all at once. Sometimes it arrives like petals from a high branch, falling slow one at a time until the ground is soft again. In the fall, I was invited to speak at a storytelling symposium, women reclaiming their narratives after betrayal, grief, abandonment. The organizer called and said, "You don't need to perform, just speak. Just be who you are." I agreed. The hall was small. The chairs were folding. There was no stage. Just a circle. They passed the microphone like a talking stick. Some cried. Some whispered. Some laughed in that sharp, breathless way women do when the absurdity of what they've endured finally cracks open. When the mic reached me, I held it without speaking. Then I said, "My name is Evelyn Marchand. I was married for 50 years. I was lied to for 40 of them. But this isn't about my husband. This is about the woman I became when I stopped asking who I was to him and started remembering who I was to myself." Silence. Then nods. Then tears. Then applause. Not the clapping kind. The kind where a dozen women exhale at once because someone finally said the thing they didn't know how to say. That night, back in my apartment, I sat at the piano. I didn't write. I didn't perform. I just played unrehearsed, unbound. I closed my eyes and let the melody emerge on its own, weaving through every note I had carried through the courtroom, through Nova Scotia, through letters and lies and laughter. I was not who I used to be. I wasn't supposed to be. Pain carves new instruments inside us. Grief tunes them. Truth plays them. Now I wake early most days, make coffee, sit by the window, watch the world go on. My students still come filling my apartment with clumsy melodies and fierce hope. Sometimes I hear them humming 50 and 1 in the hallway. They don't know its history. Not yet. They just know it feels like truth. And that's enough. Because if you've listened this far, you understand something most don't. Revenge isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes it's silence reclaimed. Sometimes it's music that doesn't apologize. Sometimes it's a woman standing in the wreckage holding her own story in both hands and refusing to put it down. If you've made it here to the end of my story, then perhaps you're not here for the drama. You're here for the quiet aftermath. The way truth settles into a room after the shouting has stopped. The way healing arrives, not with trumpets, but with footsteps on a wooden floor at dawn. What happened to me wasn't unique. And that's the real heartbreak, isn't it? That women around the world have folded their truths into drawers, bitten their tongues at dinner tables, told themselves to be patient, to be quiet, to be good. But I'm here to tell you there is life after the unraveling. There is music after the silence. There is power in picking up your own name, dusting it off, and saying, "This is mine again." I do not remember my marriage fondly, but I do not regret my years. They made me, and I remade me. That's the real legacy. Not the money, not the court records, not even the applause. It's the granddaughter who now writes her own songs. It's the student who learns not just to play notes, but to feel them. It's the woman reading this right now who whispers, "Maybe I can speak too." If you are carrying your silence like it's your inheritance, put it down. It was never yours to carry. Tell your story, even if your voice trembles, especially if it trembles, because someone out there is waiting to hear it. And when they do, they'll know they're not alone. That's how we save each other. Not all at once, but word by word, note by note, truth by truth. Welcome to Grace's Truth, where silence finally has a voice.